Welcome, everyone. Feel free to share in the chat what bioregion you're calling in from. This is BioFi Community of Practice Deep Dive, and today we are deep diving together on flow funds. And we're very excited to hear from some of our friends who will be sharing about what they've been up to in that space. Tyler, you want to welcome us
I
in?
do. There's people trickling in left and right. It's hard to keep up over
Okay.
here. But yes, it's so good to see you all. So excited for our conversation today. If this is your first time here in the BioFi community of practice, I want to give you a warm welcome and just ground us in the purpose that we're sharing here together. And so I'm pasting it in chat. You can read it there, but also read it out loud. We are here to cultivate and support a community of practitioners who are designing, capitalizing, implementing, and evolving bioregional financing facilities, peer-to-peer learning and coordination. And so these deep dive calls are one of the many things we do towards that purpose, where we get to hear from amazing folks who are pioneering and who are experimenting and who are demonstrating ways of being, ways of working with resources that are aligned to this vision we're holding for regenerative economies and the creation of bioregional financing facilities. And so we do these calls. We also hold calls with bioregional organizing teams who are working in place to set up these financing facilities. And we have an amazing space online where there's over 450 practitioners from around the world who've been attracted to these concepts and who are trying to learn from each other and support each other through all the experiments that we're running together to figure out how to do this in all of our different places. And so if you haven't, oh, there's so many people who want to come in. Give me a second. Admitting
Great.
10 more people. If you haven't checked that out online, I'm going to put the link there and you can take a look. Um, it's an amazing group that is on the software platform Hilo, which is actually originally designed to support bioregional coordination. And so it's a great place to learn and meet other groups as well beyond just the BioFi community of practice of folks who are beginning to form groups and learning communities around bioregionalism. Before I turn us to breakout rooms, I also just wanted to give a quick update from the BioFi project that some of you may have seen already. Um, but over the past 6 months, we've had the immense pleasure of getting to meet so many amazing bioregional organizing teams who were contacting us and asking how we could support. And we have decided to offer what we're calling this BioFi Cultivator in 2025, where we're going to be working with about 20 different bioregional organizing teams to walk them through the design and learning journey of building a bioregional financing facility. And so I'm putting a link in chat. Feel free to explore that on your own time. And after this call, I don't want to share more there. But I think our real hope is to cultivate a lot of wisdom and expertise among these bioregional organizing teams and find ways to share that out more broadly beyond this container with the community of practice. Um, so now we're going to get a chance to meet each other just for 10 minutes, get the social juices flowing, get the creative juices flowing before we hear from our amazing speakers. Uh,
So Tyler's going to put us in breakout groups soon, and then when we come back, we'll talk about the application of flow funding in a biofight context and hear from our speakers from Regenerosity, Kinship Earth, and a very special guest, one of the pioneers of flow funding, Marion Rockefeller Weber. Thank you for joining us here today, Marion. Okay, we got booted out of our room. Sorry for those of you that got interrupt. Really rich conversation. Hi, John. Welcome. Nice to see you here. But now we're going to get into more of the heart this discussion with our speakers. And first, I'll lay out a bit of context for us. So, most of you that are here are probably somewhat familiar with the ideas in this book on bioregional finance. bioregional financing facilities. We call them BFFs for short. So if you hear us using that acronym, that's what we're talking about. And we at the BioFi project are working on creating a new layer in the global financial institution, in the global financial architecture of financial institutions that are designed to serve the regenerative movement. And these are place-based financing facilities that are designed and governed by communities that are living in deep relationship with place. And the purpose of these facilities is to serve biocultural regeneration. And I'm gonna share my screen really quick. Actually, I want to show a few slides. So here we can see the objectives of bioregional financing facilities. And the first one is, of course, to decentralize financial resource governance. I know it's loading. Give it one sec. But that is central to the theory of change of bioregional financing facilities. And that's what flow funding is all about. The recognition that there is collective intelligence in place in communities that are listening to the forest and the watershed and the salmon population and the bison and the jaguars of their places. And that if we give them power over deciding what they invest in, we're going to make, I would argue, more efficient decisions about how that money flows and certainly more regenerative decisions. And the first five attributes of bioregional financing facilities, I was looking at the attributes before the call, and the first five are so aligned with the principles of flow funding, looking at living systems principles and indigenous wisdom and putting finance in service to that, serving the realization of a bioregional regeneration strategy that's been developed through a democratic participatory process, implementing an inclusive and participatory governance structure that really represents the bioregion, working to shift power imbalances. Flow funding certainly does that. And enabling transparent and empowered participation. So those are some of the ways I see BioFi and flow funding overlapping, but we're going to hear more from our speakers now about how they are implementing flow funding through their organizations, what their theory of change is, who are the projects that they've been granting to, this amazing technology of flow funding circles that Marion developed that we were talking about in our breakout group. And our first two speakers today are Faith Flanigan and Ruth Andrade. They are co-founders of the amazing organization Regenerosity, which for over 15 years has been identifying, spotlighting, and funding more than 400 pioneering regenerative organizations around the world, probably more since they updated their website, but that's what I got. And Regenerosity works on flowing trust-based funds to high potential community-based initiatives in threatened or degraded landscapes in ways that grow their capacities, scale, and impact. And we're going to hear a little bit about their praxis today. And Ruth and Faith, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you. I'll share the screen while Faith.
Yeah, thank you, Ruth. And then just to say, Regenerosity has actually been around for 5 years. But prior to that, the Buckminster Fuller Institute and Lush Spring Prize have been around for quite a long time, 40 years for the Buckminster Fuller Institute. And I think it's 15 for Lush Spring Prize. And I just want to say that Ruth Andrade is here with me. She's a strategic lead and the chair of the board of the Buckminster Fuller Institute. And Wagesa Jane Fraser is also here she's our East Africa lead in Kenya. And I wanted to quickly share a little bit about Regenerosity. As I said, it was initiated by myself and Ruth and Amanda Joy Ravenhill and James Atherton about 5 years ago. And it was really brought brought about to strengthen grassroots leaders and organizations who are working to protect or restore biodiversity-rich ecosystems while addressing the needs of local communities and supporting the revitalization of Indigenous and traditional cultures. And so it's a really deep belief for us that grassroots organizations are who are collaborating at bioregional scale is key to creating a thriving ecosystem. And we believe that trusted local expertise and connecting organizations and leaders to learn together and redistribute power and amplifying unheard voices is really the way forward. It's really the way to make a change. And so we do this mostly through two of our main programs, our Blossom program, which is building kind of like the long-term regenerative capacity initiatives, and then also our Seed Flow Fund program, which works to strengthen community leaders directly. And our flow funds really provide flexible. I think, Ruth, you've gone a little bit too far. Go back. Sorry. So our flow funds provide flexible funding directly to community leaders who have a deep local knowledge and trusted relationships, and they work to empower decisions on how to use the funds within their communities. And so this is really around accountability and transparency, like Sam said. It's really vested in those principles of bioregional funding and the BFFs. Okay, you can turn the page now. So I wanted to talk quickly about our theory of change because I feel like it's really vested in the work that we're doing. And we really believe that this work can't be done without catalyzing the flow of resources towards regenerative projects and processes. And that's really guided by this deep listening and transparency and sovereignty for communities that are working in place. So our work is really vested in these three pillars, which is place-based impact, where we're supporting ground-up initiatives driven by community-centered leaders and organizations who are working to strengthen the resiliency and capacity of their land and communities. And these are people that really understand the context of the land that they're on and their landscape. Network collaboration, where we work with collaborators, funders, and aligned partners like BioFi and Kinship Earth. And we share knowledge, resources, connect with, and amplify the stories from the ground up. And we build a web of regenerative movements through spotlighting our regenerative partners' stories and amplifying their reach. And we do this through our programs. You can turn the page, Ruth, which are really vested in that theory of change and believe that healthy ecosystems supported by just and equitable flows of capital is the only way to move forward. So our Blossom program is a participatory grant giving program where we work with grassroots organizations to co-design a 2-year project to strengthen organizations' capacity and build their network through peer-to-peer knowledge sharing and then storytelling and create direct connections with other funders. I did want to say this because we just launched our Atlantic dryland rainforest cohort in Brazil with 4 Indigenous communities that are really working on biocentric-led restoration. And this is one of our kind of bioregional approaches to participatory grant giving. And then we're also launching our next cohort in East Africa in the Victoria Basin around disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation, which is also another bioregional approach to participatory grant giving. Our seed program, which is our flow funds, places the decision-making in the hands of the community leaders. And we see this as a way to rapidly deploy funds through relationships that we've built and that are built from our partners on the ground. I think Marion is here and will share more about how flow funds actually started. And I'm really excited to hear from her as a pioneer and yeah, just an incredible force. And then our work is done through the storytelling programs, through our Pollinate program, which is amplifying the voices from our partners through our webinar series and our outreach. We're also building a film series with our partners at a growing culture called Liberation Ag. And that's really around raising awareness around regenerative agriculture. And then we also steward a funder community practice, which is different ways of power sharing through funder relationships with knowledge, resource, and collective funding. So I'm going to get into the Seed Flow Fund program quickly, and then Ruth will share about our actual flow funds. So the Flow Fund program is really based on these community leaders where we have deep accountability and transparency, trusting that our community leaders who have the intrinsic knowledge of where funds are needed most at any given time have the power to make those decisions. And so we started our flow funds as a way to move beyond traditional grant giving, removing barriers of arduous reporting and applications, which is still a part of the participatory grant giving program. Seed Flow Funds really just places direct resources in the hands of community leaders. And so this program is really driven by a need to, or like a purpose around empowering recipients to address these emerging needs and opportunities to create immediate impact in their communities through nimble and adaptive funding. So flow funding is really vested in the power sharing, building trust between funders and recipients. It explores flexible alternative ways of capturing and sharing metrics that are co-aligned with flow funders' needs. And we worked with many of our partners, such as Be the Earth, Kindle Project, One Small Planet, and Kinship Earth, to understand kind of like the depth and the best practices for flow funding. And the way we design our flow funds are really around putting the decisions about who gets to be a flow funder in our partners' hands who are actually in the communities that we're working with. And so each flow fund has a specific region or theme. And then Regenerosity chooses an advisory board to select these local organizations within the region that we're working in and around the thematics that we're working in. Ruth can go into this a little bit more. And then the local organizations nominate leaders to be the flow funders. And then we coordinate the team and advisors to interview them and then review the programs and assess the fit. And then throughout the program, generally it's between 6 months to a year-long program. We meet several times to kind of help to build capacity and create workshops around communication, storytelling, oftentimes just how to manage the funds. And then we share progress. And then at the end, we have a celebration. And I'm going to hand it over to Ruth.
Unmute myself. There we go. Yeah, I wanted to share a little bit about what we're doing in Brazil. So we started the Indigenous Women Flow Fund of Brazil with a local women-led indigenous organization in Brazil called Payaca Institute. And I just asked that question. I said, if we manage to fundraise some funds, how would you like to distribute this? So we created this flow funds together, but I would say all the heavy decision making is in the hands of Indigenous women. And the way that they chose to do it, instead of selecting a bioregion, they chose to fund the whole country. So one woman per state. So we have 26 different ethnicities. And they selected, there was a lot of care in who gets to make the decision, which I think is really important also to avoid conflict within the Indigenous women groups in Brazil and that kind of demographic. So they decided to choose local organizations and nominate women. And just to tell a couple of stories from the most recent one, the most recent one were Indigenous women in the northeast of Brazil, the south, southeast, and the south. So again, Indigenous communities that are outside of the Amazon have their own very specific challenges. And just to share some of those, we had 4 women from areas that are in active conflict. And active conflict means that there is usually a conflict between the Indigenous communities and surrounding farmers. And the Ariane that you can see in the photo, we actually got the funds to her the weekend that they got shot at by farmers. So the whole community was surrounded, and it was the only way that they had to be able to get funds to get people into hospital, because the money was already in their bank account. So that was not the idea for the fund, but because this is trust-based, because that was all the need, and that was what could protect the community at the time, they could use the funds as they saw fit. Ivanilda as well, it's an amazing, beautiful program called the Water Women, and they've been restoring a river through traditional medicine, traditional knowledge, traditional practices. And again, it was beautiful to see what they did with the funds. We have a video with stories that we can share as well from our ritual. In East Africa, and Wegesa is here as well, we supported women and youth in permaculture. The initial Flow Fund, now we're evolving for it to be have a more bioregional focus. And again, the idea is that you have local advisors from those contexts, and they make the decisions of who is going to flow the funds. So at Regenerosity, we didn't even want to decide who the flow funders were. We also put that in the hands of the community. And what we also found is, for us, the Flow Fund is a way to identify who are the community leaders, how they work. And for example, for the East Africa Flow Fund, we were able to get further funding and fund a bigger project with one of the amazing flow funders, and Vegesa, that we did really beautiful work restoring their area through permaculture and agroecology. Faith, I'll pass it over to you for the last one.
Thanks, Ruth. So we'll wrap it up right now. But we have a second cycle for the East Africa Flow Fund that we're about to launch in February. And that's really a bioregional fund around working with women in land-based initiatives, supporting food sovereignty and livelihoods around the buffer zones of the priority habitats. So this is really spanning across the East African coastal forest bioregion. And we're using ONER's Global Safety Net Map as kind of like the bioregional biodiversity zones that these women will be working in. And this is I think just one thing I'd like to seed is that flow funding is oftentimes a prototype, or we're testing how flow funding works. And it's been really beautiful to see kind of the results of what we've worked with. I did want to see one last thing, which was, can you bring up the last slide? Which is really around kind of seeding some ideas on how flow funding works within a bioregional context. So one of the things that we're looking at is giving leaders flexible financial capital to take on issues as they emerge in their bioregion, flowing resources from organizations within a bioregion towards grassroots projects in that area, allocating funds to those that are best positioned to drive regenerative change from within. And then for outside funders, having a key liaison who really understand the context of the community, and they're from the bioregion, as a bridge for language and cultural divide. I think that's it, Sam and Tyler.
Thank you, guys. Wow. So inspiring. So many questions. This is really beautiful. Thank you for sharing the link to the Brazil Flow Fund in the chat, and amazing to hear how kind of the strategy shifted to meet the urgent needs of the communities there. And, indeed, I think that's one of the real benefits of applying a flow funding approach, is that it can be responsive to what is alive in the moment. And certainly in the time of ecological crisis and polycrisis, we need to practice emergent strategy and respond to what is needed in a given moment. We'll have time for a Q&A, so folks will have a chance to ask Ruth and Faith more questions, but if you already want to start putting your questions in the chat, that's great. And now we're going to hear from my friend Sid Griffith from Kinship Earth. Sid is the executive director of Kinship Earth, and she is also one of the co-founders of an organization called Permators. So I think we've got a whole bunch of permies on this call today, which is great. And Kinship Earth is doing the work of facilitating direct, unrestricted grants to grassroots leaders making a difference in the world now. And she's going to tell us a little bit more about what that looks like. Over to you, Sid.
Thank you so much, Samantha and Tyler and team at BioFi and everyone here. I am so thrilled to be here. Hi, Danny. It just brings me so much joy to do this work. And like you mentioned, Sam, given the state of the world, I'm just honored to be in this field, and it really gives me hope. So thank you all for joining me in this, and I'm going to share my screen for a presentation. Can you all see my screen? Beautiful. So I'm going to kick it off with this slide here, which breaks down a side-by-side comparison of flow funding versus top-down giving. Faith did a great job, but I'll just highlight some key components here, which you can see on the left-hand side with all the check marks. Flow funding is much less bureaucratic than top-down giving because there are no grant applications, and at Kinship Earth, we do not request extensive reports from our grantees, but rather, we ask for narrative stories of impact. And as Faith also shared, flow funding is really about relationships. It's relationship driven. And we invite all of our flow funders and donors and our team members to come together as a part of a community of practice to learn and support one another in their journey. So fundamentally, it's really about increasing access to resources and streamlining the flow of funds. And an important component is asking our flow funders to answer the questions that Marion Weber, the pioneer of the approach, originally asked, which was, what surprised you in flow funding? What challenged you? What moved you? And what inspired you? And there's also a lot of data that backs up the effectiveness of funding grassroots initiatives versus top-down initiatives. And I can definitely speak to that during the Q&A if it comes up. This slide here walks you through our process. It's quite simple. I'll start with step 1 in the upper left-hand corner here. You can see we direct resources to trusted community leaders. And then in step 2, these leaders distribute the funds locally when they feel called to do so during their term serving, which is about 1 year. And they do this in whatever quantities that they deem appropriate. And then in step 3, our flow funders share their stories of impact. And in step 4, we also invite our flow funders to help us select the next round of flow funders to serve. And importantly, we do invite our donors and our grantors to share with Kinship Earth Flow Fund the bioregions where they'd like to see the funds deployed, and that can guide our deployment efforts. So speaking of bioregionalism, at Kinship Earth, we're focused on deploying flow funds to bioregional-based groups of leaders who decide together how to flow the resources in their communities and ecosystems. And the ROI for donors who do choose to give to their specific bioregions are healthier, stronger, and more resilient communities where they live. So for Kinship Earth, you can see here in this slide, our priorities as far as impact. So that means that we're deploying funds to bioregional organizing groups with these kinds of focus areas of planetary regeneration and indigenous rights and land rematriation, food sovereignty and food and housing security, social justice and economic equity, disaster preparedness and relief, advancements in ecosystems and human health. And we actually just deployed our first round of flow funding grants in October of 2024. And we'll be deploying again and onboarding a new cohort of flow funders next month. So after our flow funders serve, we'll then recognize them on our website and we'll share their stories of impact. So, Sam, you asked, what are we excited about at Kinship Earth? I'm personally really excited about our resource center or resource garden, to use your term. And that means we're aggregating and sharing relevant materials from our partners like BioFi. And these partners are individuals and groups that are deep in the world of flow funding and also making strides in the bioregional movement. So we'll definitely be sharing materials on collective decision-making processes for bioregional organizing groups and other materials that support bioregional groups with flow funding. We're also excited about our efforts to increase the adoption of flow funding globally. And that means teaching individual donors about the approach and how they can embrace it, teaching foundations how to incorporate flow funding into their giving practice, and then also, of course, working with bioregional organizing groups and supporting them in practicing flow funding. And then we're also creating a Flow Funder Starter Kit in collaboration with the Earth Regeneration Fund and designing interactive educational sessions to support bioregional organizing groups and others with creating their own flow funds. So circling back to what you mentioned, Sam, as far as like the different facets of flow funding, our starter kit and our online educational sessions will cover agreement documentation templates that groups can use to make agreements with flow funders. The kit will also include legal and compliance considerations, including different agreements to have when giving to individuals that are flow funding versus when giving to nonprofits that are flow funding, and also information about legal entity types for those practicing flow funding. We'll talk about selection criteria and how selection happens, participatory grant making. We'll talk about the importance of capturing narrative stories of impact to demonstrate the power of flow funding and also to support fundraising efforts. We will talk about trust-based accountability and the structure of communities of practice, which I've been learning a lot from Regenerosity. And we'll talk about giving stipends or honorariums to flow funders who need financial support in order to do this work. We'll talk about tailoring this approach to bioregional needs or to the needs of specific bioregions. We'll share examples of successful flow funds, and we'll share lessons learned amongst the network. And clearly, Kinship Earth, we're babies in the space, so the goal here is really to support with holding space for learning and inviting experts from other flow funds that have been doing this for far longer than Kinship Earth. So with all of that said, I invite you to join us in transforming philanthropy. There's plenty of ways to get involved at Kinship Earth. And if you're interested in learning more about this approach to giving and staying up to date on what we're working on, please feel free to share your information in the chat so I can make sure to add you to our e-list. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Sid. Yes, some incredible tables and charts and things there. And that toolkit, that's going to be so helpful. And I'm really excited to share that with more members of the BioFi community of practice and all the bioregional organizing teams we're working with to build BFFs. That's going to be so helpful. Feel free to share your questions for Sid in the chat. We're going to hear for just a few minutes from Marion. Marion is certainly one of the pioneers, if not the pioneer of flow funding. I would say, this is probably an ancient technology that Indigenous communities have been using for a long time, but Marion kind of stewarded its modern iteration and has spread it around the world and inspired so many organizations like Regenerosity, like Kinship Earth. And Marion, we'd love to hear what wisdom you would like to share with us today, what's exciting you and inspiring you in this moment, and how can we make sure that in our enthusiasm around this work, we're maintaining the integrity of the vision that you set out.
Thank you so much. I'm just smiling. I have nothing to really say. I am so thrilled. Everything is exactly the way I could ever imagine it to be. I'm speechless. It's really true. It seems like Regenerosity and Sydney, they're both, they get the essence of what's needed right now. I mean, it's just so obvious that we should be asking community leaders for guidance about how to go about using funds. It's just so critical. I love the fact of storytelling coming in more. All the feelings I have about flow funding are represented today in what I've heard. And so I can just relax. I do have a vision that in this time, and you'll see on my website, flowfunding.org, this vision spelled out, that is absolutely critical that flow funding is practiced globally, locally, and globally. It could be used any name, doesn't have to be that name, but you get the idea of what it is. It's relationship-based philanthropy. It's listening to the voices of people that are involved in the field and giving them funds to use as they see fit to use in the moment. And we're going to need more and more of that as the emergence of new life on the planet happens through the emergency that we're experiencing right now. Yeah, that's well said. That's exactly where it's at. This is a time of emergence and emergency. And so we need a quick form of understanding how help can go out to people all over the world. But certainly in the bioregions, it makes sense to focus on one area so that the people know about the environment and the needs of the people there. I love that's happening now. It makes so much sense. And in my day, it was different because I was just starting the practice, and my thrill was to get the money out all over the world just through intelligent, loving hands. And so that's how we began. But right now, I love the idea of bioregionalism because it's the land and it's the heart of the people connected, how to go forward in a way that nurtures all of life. And now we have obvious signs of the deterioration of integrity and deterioration of the environment due to not seeing what is needed. Okay, so it is my prayer and hope that this forum will be useful in this time really of crisis. And I see it as really important that it is being practiced through. I mean, I'm so thrilled to learn more about regenerosity. I'm so thrilled to hear Sydney's voice. And what an opportunity for people to get involved with their inheritance, with their money, to give it to these organizations that have so much integrity. And we need integrity now because we don't have it in so many places. So wherever we can find it, let's support it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marion. Thank you for those beautiful reflections.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I think we're gonna open it up for Q&A shortly, but in the spirit of what Marion shared about responding to emergence and emergency, I want to recognize that what is happening in LA right now with these horrific fires, there's going to be a real need to organize flow funds and to flow funds to people that are deeply connected with their communities and have a vision for regenerative redevelopment in that place, and the people that are already holding relationships and ways of rebuilding that are more aligned with Earth stewardship and taking care of our Earth rather than rebuilding the way things were before. And I see our friend and colleague Carrie Norton sharing in the chat that she's bringing together some bioregionalists around the idea of creating a flow fund in LA. And we also have Holly McCann on the call, one of the bioregionalists bioregional organizing teams that's going to be participating in the BioFi Cultivator is Regenerate Asheville, that Holly is playing a lead role in. And Holly stepped into a need that she saw to respond to the floods in Asheville and to support regenerative redevelopment there. There's so much money that flows into a bioregion after a disaster like Asheville experienced or LA is experiencing right now. And how do we ensure that that is flowing to communities rather than corporations? So maybe something for us to reflect on as we're getting into the discussion here today. Tyler, you want to facilitate the Q&A for us?
I do. I do. I've seen some great questions in the chat already, and I encourage you all to raise your hands or put it in the chat if you're more comfortable there, and I'll try to tend to what's happening in the chat as well as who's raising their hand. But I want to invite Monty's question to come forward because I saw that there was a lot of engagement there. And as we're talking about this, feel free to raise your hand if other questions come to you. Monty, do you want to give some words to your curiosity?
Sure. Yeah. So recently I've been going really deep into a framework called the Common Impact Data Standard, built by the Common Approach. And they've studied hundreds of social impact organizations to categorize impact according to, key domains. It's kind of like an ontology for impact data. And the kind of classic stuff you see in there is, the difference between an activity versus an output versus an outcome. And then that then allows you to report on the impact that you're creating with deploying the funds. And then obviously that reporting is usually what enables you to unlock more funds in the future from other funders, especially when there's so much demand for funds and so many potential things that could be funded. It seems like one way to allocate capital is to have really good ways of measuring and reporting impact such that capital can find its ways to the highest impact projects, et cetera. And so I'm curious, with flow funding, it could seem like there may be almost infinite demand for flow funds. And then how are you working out what are the best ways to deploy that? Or is there any form of MRV or how does flow funding think about all of those things? So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's broadly my question.
Beautiful. Thanks, Monty. Yeah, so I tossed that to Faith and Sydney and Ruth.
Yeah, happy to start that, but I would love for Ruth to jump in too, unless Ruth, you already have something.
No, I'll just a couple of things that came to mind is I think the flow funds don't exist in a vacuum, right? Usually there is always a directionality behind them. So, this is the change that collectively or systemically we want to make happen in a bioregion. And I don't think, I actually don't, I think it's impossible that all the funds coming into a bioregion are going to be flow funds. This is a dream that's very far into the future. So I think it's what's the appropriate use of the flow funds, either also as leadership development and capability development to focus on things that need a certain level of agility, to fund perhaps things where the outputs and outcomes and impacts are not so clear. So I think there are many, you need to choose what's the appropriate use of flow fund for us. And there is an infinite need for funds for us, especially the one that I'm closest related to in Brazil. The aims is there's also a level of leadership development. So the indigenous coordinator, they decided that they want the flow fund to focus on, we call the hidden leaders of the community. So the women in the community that have a history of doing really amazing work, but they're often not recognized. So what does it mean to give money into the hands of those hyper connectors, right? But that often don't get recognized, and use that for capability building. So I think that's, we have a clear focus in that regard. And then I also believe that stories, no one reads long reports. We are all wasting hours and hours and hours and hours of really important time in the whole of civil society, putting together a bunch of data and a bunch of reports, and no one reads. So what we did as a strategy, we invite the funders, because we are a grantor, we're not a foundation, so we invite the funders to sit in circle with the women and hear firsthand, you know, what they were able to manifest with their money. And that's much more powerful than a million reports that we can write. And then we do it through rituals. There is song, there is prayer, there is, you know, connection. People feel part of it. And I think that's what we need. And yeah, and just to say, I think there's a lot of talk about using AI agents to distribute funds. This is about relationships. So I think we also need to be mindful that this is about relationality and relationships. So yeah, and then how do we make funders feel part of the story because we're involving them? So I think I'll say this, but again, it's not for everything. We need to be intentional about how we're going to use flow funds in a bioregion, and usually for things where traditional philanthropy would suck at, you know.
Yeah, just to add to that, because that Ruth said it so well, that the reporting or the report backs, I would say, or the sharing is really determined by the community groups that create the container. So we are not dictating anything, and I think that that's a really important point, that, you know, funders are asking for certain metrics or measurements, and within flow funding, there is no real request for those types of impact metrics. It's really around storytelling. What is happening on the ground? How do we build these relationships? So I think just to add to that.
Thank you, guys. I see your hand, Stuart. Is it okay if I add a little here before your question? Okay. So my immediate answer here is that, as I mentioned earlier, we don't ask for individuals or groups to fill out grant applications, but once the flow funders are selected, we do ask them to fill out a basic form about themselves. And then when they deploy funds, we do have to ask for the basics for the IRS and for our funders, which is, you know, collecting info on when were the funds deployed, to whom were they deployed, what quantity was deployed, and for what purpose. And then after some time, ideally at the end of their term, which is around 1 year, then collecting the stories of impact, because of course it takes time for impact to unfold. And at Kinship Earth, we also do plan to identify patterns with data collected after several years of doing flow funding. But like I mentioned, you know, it takes time for these patterns to emerge. And we do want to support the field of flow funding by aggregating data from all the different flow funds out there who are willing to share it, to share the impact of this approach. But yeah, I would say I love John's comment in the chat. I think it was John, about the requirements for data, because yeah, that really does decrease access for a lot of recipients if they have all of these requirements and they don't have experience collecting a lot of hard data. So we're trying to decrease those barriers by really leaning on the stories.
And just to say as well that Regenerosity, we have a much longer program, which is 2 years, and then, you know, there is more of a traditional like project design. But yeah, we found Flow Fund as this just beautiful way of also connecting to the field. Yeah. But John, I don't know, John seems to, yeah, okay, cool.
It looks like John has to hop, but thanks for that provocative comment there. And I've been following the chat in the chat, so we'll bring that forward as we can. Claire, I believe you had a question way back in the chat, and I saw you raise your hand first, so we'll go to you, and then we'll go to Stuart.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, the thing I'm really interested in is the long-term relationships. So bringing in the flow funding, but that's sort of, but the people that are doing the weaving between the projects and are helping to actually hold the relationships. You know, my knowledge of communities is the people who've been there for the long time kind of know the stories. And those are also the people that have been really unacknowledged and unsupported. And so they've basically done it off their own backs. And I'm just sort of wondering about, I guess, valuing the role that they have played and starting to build the supports to support and enhance their work. Because honestly, I feel like the world hasn't fallen apart yet because of those people. Yeah, so questions to all of you. And just to put in there that the work that Regenerate Cascadia is doing and the program we're about to roll out is really sort of, that's kind of a really central question that we're holding. So love hearing what you're talking about with all of the work you're doing, and just it's so complementary. But that is a really critical question that we're looking to try, sort of, start developing around.
Claire, just to answer from our end, and we also have another partner organization, Be the Earth Foundation, that aren't here, but they do many flow funding circles and are pretty big in the space. And I think when they did it the first time, they didn't support the flow funders, and then the second time they actually have quite a big stipend for the flow funders, because everyone understands that kind of knowledge and intelligence that you have about the community also has been built through a lot of time and labor and hard work. So they are resourcing that now. In Brazil, and I think in East Africa as well, we have the community leaders and the flow funders. We say that part of the funds they should use for their own self-care. So what do they need in order to keep being community leaders? And they can use some of their money. And sometimes they'll fund a dentist. Sometimes they'll fund, something that their family needs, something that just allows them to keep being a community leader. So I think it's super important to acknowledge that. And then I think it's also important to do the strengthening of the local organizations through this. And that's why these partnerships are important. That's why we're also not just doing we did that before as well, just funding the leaders. Now we also want the local organizations to support those community leaders that are flow funders. And we're also getting some really good results in having the local organization supporting more the work, supporting the community leaders, also being jointly accountable. I think those are some of the learnings that we've been having as well. It would be amazing to collect all the learnings, as Steve said, like once we can do all of that through Kingship Earth. Yeah. Did that answer your question, Claire? I'll pass it over to Sid if you have anything to add, or anyone. But yeah, organizational strengthening as well of the local organizations, and making sure leaders have self-care, like have the capacity for.
Yeah, no, I think that the organization, it's a complex field that needs to support those people. So, and I think you're saying that, but I am really interested, because it's like, how do you maintain the longevity of those relationships rather than short-term coming in, supporting, and then the funding goes somewhere else, but it actually leaves those relationships that you've now started to activate and then leaves them hanging. So how do we, that is relationship and trust building, right? Is sort of that signaling that we're here for the long term. We're not just coming to test, do what we want. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thanks for that question, Claire, and those thoughtful responses, Ruth. I'd love to move it to Stuart. And I know there's a couple other questions in the chat.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. Genuinely really interesting to hear everything that's being done here, and so much resonance with everything that's going on in the world right now. And just to sort of join between sort of Monty's question about monitoring and reporting, and then to come into flow. Flow says to me that we need to do monitoring and reporting in flight, as in as things are happening, to get real-time data back. And often we do monitoring and reporting at the end of a project, and we go, well, what worked? But this doesn't tell us what's going on. And I think this is where the stories are so important, because they tell us what's going on and they tell us where the work is. And this needs said in this in-flight way. I've just not long finished a pilot project that allowed us to look at some of this stuff by using stories and collecting them into frameworks. Rather than go into it now, if anybody wants to know more, I'll be happy to share. It's been a novel approach looking at sort of how to use the stories in complex systems, but also how to then kick this up through network layers. So we take stories from a project and then can look at a program by stacking those stories together, and then stacking those stories together and then looking at a portfolio. And it allows us to get the signal out of the noise, so that we're really starting to see what people are trying to say through this in-flight way. So look, if anyone wants to know, I'm happy to share that outside of this meeting. Thank you.
I'll respond briefly. Yeah, and I might have shared this a little bit earlier, but just to reiterate, the form that I mentioned where we ask questions of flow funders right after they deploy, yeah, we do ask for them to fill it out pretty immediately after deploying when it's fresh on their mind. But then again, we give them time for the story to unfold. And then at the end of their 1-year term, we ask for the story. And all media forms are accepted to make that process of storytelling accessible. But of course, we do encourage video, because apparently people like watching videos more than other forms of media. The other thing I wanted to note, which I think Ruth and Faith definitely alluded to, are the concept of liaisons, which Kinship Earth is not working with liaisons at this point, but I've heard from other organizations that when a group is deploying internationally or overseas, or in a place where there might be a lack of like cultural understanding or a language barrier, flow funding organizations will hire a liaison who's deeply connected and a part of the community that's being resourced. And that person will support with the communication flow between the flow funders and the end recipients and the organization itself. So that way, the flow funders and end recipients don't have as much work on them and as much communication to do, because that liaison is a trusted go-to person for information when it's
Thanks. And I would just add to that there's this additional piece, which is the coming together. And we're actually working with Kinship Earth, and I really love the way that we gather through a tempo, and with our flow funds, we gather on a monthly basis to kind of share these stories and share. So there's a cadence to it. And so part of that is sharing widely as well through. We have a couple of Instagram channels, one for the Brazilian Flow Fund and one for the East Africa Flow Fund. And that brings more attention to these kind of like the solo actors that don't get the attention, which is what Claire was talking about. How do you bring more attention to the work that these people are doing? So I think that there's not just like a culmination, like you were talking about, Stuart, where at the end of the project, there's the end report. This is happening throughout the entire cycle of the fund and then beyond, honestly, because those relationships have been made and those bonds have been made. And so there's continual relationships being built after the program as well.
Wonderful. I saw Andrew had a question above and a new question in the chat. I'm just curious, Andrew McHugh, if you want to come off mute and share what's alive right now for you.
Well, hi everyone. I'll take the privacy screen off. Thanks so much for everything you shared. I'm just typing down these questions as they come up. So I might have forgotten my earlier one. Oh yeah, the first one is flow funders. You're going into an organization or a region where you aren't based. When you're looking for someone to be a flow funder, how are you identifying potential flow funders? Second question I had was around how is it materially different from something like giving direct giving? For instance, I have a recurring donation with Give Directly. My hunch is that it has to do with relationship. I don't have any relationship there. The money's just going to people. And the third one is, how do we increase the amount of total capital going into flow funds?
Great questions. Ruth or Faith, do you want to share first, or would you like me to share?
You can go first. Go first.
Cool. So as I mentioned, Kinship Earth, we just deployed our first round in October. So as far as selecting those flow funders, we worked with our flow fund advisors for this first round. And these are individuals who are grassroots change makers who have incredible reputations of making an impact in their communities, oftentimes with very little resources. So we leaned on them to select this first round. But for future rounds, we will be inviting our flow funders who have served to help select the next round. And then also, I think I mentioned this in the presentation, if a specific donor or grantor has a particular bioregion where they want to flow resources, that will influence our deployment. So we'll identify ideally a bioregional organizing group in that bioregion and then start building relationships there to then take steps towards selecting a flow funder. And in some cases, there isn't a bioregional organizing group, right? So that, of course, just involves relationship building until we feel comfortable with deployment there. And I guess I'll turn it over to you guys, Faith and Ruth, before I answer the other questions.
I think maybe Ruth, you can talk to our current or past flow funds and then like the new flow fund.
I think also because and then Wigisa is on this call as well. She can share about East Africa, but I think for us, we're relying on local organizations. So what we have done is identify. So for example, for Brazil, we identified through a large network of Indigenous women who are really good Indigenous women-led organizations. And then we invited them to nominate a leader that could be a flow funder. So again, we tried to make sure that decision is closer to the people that understand what's going on within their context. And then the Indigenous coordinators put some boundaries or criteria for those Indigenous leaders. So they wanted to make sure that they weren't already employed by the government, or they weren't the director or on the board of the local association. And then there were also some themes, right? So women that were working on, culture revitalization or land restoration, but also domestic violence. So domestic violence was a theme that emerged. So it wasn't on our original list, but we realized from doing it the first time that the women we were talking to were all involved in different elements of losing the culture, losing the fabric of community also always results in more violence against women. So we introduced that theme. So, it's emerging and we were really listening to what was coming. Wigis, I don't know if you want to talk about East Africa and how we did the organizations for the coastal forests by region.
Thank you, Ruth. Yeah. So we Regenerosity reached out to some of the people that we've been working with in regenerating communities, livelihoods, empowering women, and we focused on especially women empowering women and the youth in the communities. And we identified leaders who have integrity, who are doing their work with little or without funding, mobilizing people to do great works out there. And we also ask organizations that are working in these areas, in these themes, to nominate people that they think can benefit from this kind of fund. And so out of that, we get a list of people, and we go through what they're doing, and then we select out of those people what they're doing. We so far got very impactful leaders from the communities, and especially those training women and youth in arid areas where there's no food and little rain, and help them create kitchen gardens, rejuvenating the soils, improving livelihoods, probably investing in things like chicken raising or poultry, or even just buying and selling vegetables in stores or groceries, small dry cereals in small shops to just make an income. So those are some of the activities. We train them also in permaculture techniques or regenerative farming systems, and they learn to produce more from little spaces, from those who are in urban areas, probably doing a container farming to help them ease pressure on purchasing things like vegetables, tomatoes, onions for use in the houses. And these are people, actually, we give resources to people who are completely not having any resources, especially young mothers who are just married or have children and they don't have any income. And this helps them a lot to start doing something. So it's been a great help.
Beautiful. Thanks, Vikesa. And Wikika is
and-
also a
and-
Flow Fundee as well. So we created one of these groups for our last East Africa Flow Fund. I wanted to just add something really quick, Ruth. Or do you want to add something before I had something?
Yeah, I'll just say something that I put in the chat. For the people that are really into data here and DAOs and things like this, with Spring Prize at Lush, we received so many applications, right? Every year we run a prize. Every second year we run a prize. We collect usually between 400 and 600 applications. And we always ask, who are your partners? And we have done a network map of all the organizations that apply to Regenerosity. And we identified what are the nodes. So we did a network map and we could identify the organizations that were most mentioned by who do you partner with. And so doing that kind of network map in the bioregion, you can very quickly identify who are the nodes of your community. That we also did this internally at Lush to identify the hidden leaders, of the business. And so, yeah, network maps is a great way to use data to identify potential organizations that can either be flow funders themselves or nominate flow funders, in ways that is more data-led. Faith, sorry.
What tool do you like to use for that, Ruth?
Kumo. We used Kumo for that. Yeah, so we just harvested all the information from the application forms and put it on Kumo, and we could identify the big, really, it's a map of the regenerative organizations around the world, grassroots, and you can clearly see the nodes of who are the people developing most relationships. They would be amazing flow funders. You could give them $1 million and they would distribute the funds easily.
Yeah, true.
Ruth, did you want to come in? Or sorry, Faith.
It's okay. I was just going to say, so we're also taking a bioregional approach to our East Africa Flow Fund for this next cohort or this next cycle. And part of that is really identifying organizations that are within that key bioregion. And I think having trusted people already in the system, we've worked with folks that are located in those areas for years and have, like Ruth said, we have partners and we also have leaders that are in those spaces that we continue to come back to help us design these funds. And so I think really understanding kind of the region and the communities that are working within them and also our allies. So did you want to add something?
I was going to answer the question about how is this different than direct giving, if we're ready to transition to that. Yeah? Okay. So Marion could also speak to this, I'm sure. But when an individual gives to another individual in the flow funding way, the idea is that they're giving to an individual and trusting that individual to deploy the funds however they see fit. So it's not just giving money to someone for their own personal benefit. It's inviting that person to become a philanthropist, to experience the magic of giving. And in the world of flow funding as a 501c3 nonprofit, there's some things to navigate as far as flowing money. Of course, the IRS has questions. There's legalities to consider, as I mentioned, that we'll be sharing in the Flow Funder Starter Kit that we're deep in the weeds of. But Marion, did you want to note anything?
Oh, I just wanted to say that we gave gifts that were labeled as gifts. In other words, if you give $15,000, it's not a problem with the IRS. So that's something to think about because it gets sort of messy, when you get have to report everything to the IRS. So we did that quite a bit. We just would never give more than that amount, and therefore the requirements from us for the government were not so heavy. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And for Kinship Earth, we definitely want to be, as a part of our educational efforts, educating individuals on how they can directly give, not through Kinship Earth. And in that case, definitely letting them know that there are these limits before the gift has to be treated as income. So in 2024, it was $18,000 per US citizen per year. So there was no reporting required if an individual gave less than that amount. But again, when it comes to a 501c3 giving money, there's some other requirements. But yeah, that's how it's different than direct giving.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think it's about time that we wrap up.
See Steve raising a hand.
I do see Steve raising a hand. Steve, do you have something that you can do within a minute? You're on mute, friend.
First of all, it's very heartening to be here and see all the young people. We don't want this to be a gerontocracy. So this is so great to see the young people here. It really is empowering. And thank you, Marion, for all that you've done. I just want to say one thing that we've learned is that it's very, very important to look in at the grassroots and talk to the people at the grassroots because they know who's making a difference. And so that we used to have these positions called ambassadors that we wanted to have ambassadors from various geographic regions whose job was to go down and really know those grassroots activists. And those peer groups really do understand who's making the big difference. So anyway, thank you all. It's very, very encouraging.
Thanks for being here.
Could I ask, is this program going to be able to be seen by other people? Yeah?
Yes.
Good, thank you.
We should have a YouTube link up probably within 24 hours.
Great.
And we'll email it out to anyone who RSVP'd on the Luma, and we'll also share it in our community of practice on Hilo, and we'll make sure we just email you a link.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. That's great news.
Our amazing intern Carla is here. Carla makes it all possible. Shout out to Carla. Thank you.
Wrap up with any concluding thoughts?
No?
Over to me. Amazing. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I'm just going to put a couple standard reminders and links in the chat. Our Hilo group is growing rapidly. We're at like 450 people. And I saw some folks post in the chat that they're looking to find people near them, both around LA and in Denver, and in other countries outside the US. And if you log into that Hilo group, there's a map feature where you can see where are all these people who are coming together to discuss BioFi located, and you can easily send them a message or just put a post saying, hey, I'm looking for collaborators and support in a certain region. Is anyone out there? So I'd highly encourage that. And we've put the Google Calendar for our events. We'll be adding a couple of new events soon, including a guide for how bioregional organizing teams can be using this Hilo platform to support their organizing efforts and even support mutual aid efforts. And then, yeah, we're still inviting folks who have anything that they'd like to present about in the community of practice to let us know via this field building call form. We go through that form regularly and try to seek what interesting ideas, what interesting work wants to be shared, and how can we connect folks at work. And then lastly is just that link to the cultivator, so you can follow along with what we're up to behind the scenes. That's all I got. I would love if you all could come off mute and share some woohoo, share some thank yous, share some chows and bye-byes.
And I do thank Shaith and Ruth and Sydney and Marion for being with us today. And yeah, everyone who came and participated, such a rich discussion. Clearly, there's so much more here to talk about, and we will continue to have this discussion asynchronously on Hilo, but also in future community of practice events. And as we're designing and creating these bioregional financing facilities in the cultivator, So really looking forward to continuing to engage with all of you, and thank you for coming today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
everyone.
Well, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, Marion.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
So good to see
Thank
you,
you.
Marion.